Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Remy Jeva. I'm a professor of economics and international affairs at GW. I'm also the director of the Institute for International Economic Policy. And I'm a co-director of the Elliott School Local Sustainable Governance Lab, which focuses on how to enhance the role of subnational governance, local governance in addressing climate change and sustainability challenges. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to today's Wenger Family Lecture on International Business and Finance, featuring esteemed guest Secretary Verma. I also want to thank the Wenger family for making this event possible. At IIEP, we're dedicated to bringing together leading thinkers and students to learn more about the world's pressing global challenges and opportunities. Today, this event is a powerful example of this connection. I also want to use this as an opportunity to flag some of our events that we're organizing in the coming weeks. On October 23rd, which is, I think, tomorrow already. Well, 2 days, yeah, it went so fast. We'll host alongside Citigroup and Moody's a sovereign's rating simulation by Moody's, followed by a panel discussion on how ratings agencies affect emerging markets. On November 15th, we'll host a former Foreign Minister of South Korea, Park Jin, for discussion on U.S.-South Korea relations after the U.S. presidential election. And on December 2nd, we'll host a second World Bank UVA conference on the economics of sustainable development. It is now my pleasure to introduce the Dean of the Elliott School, Dean Alisa Ayres. Dean Ayres is a foreign policy practitioner and award-winning author with senior experience in the government, non-profit, and private sectors. She was appointed Dean of the Elliott School in 2021 and is the first woman to serve as permanent Dean at the Elliott School. From 2013 to 2021, she was a senior fellow for India, Pakistan, and South Asia as a consul on foreign relations, where she remains an adjunct senior fellow. And from 2010 to 2013, she served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for South Asia. Her work primarily focuses on India's role in the world and on U.S. relations with South Asia and the larger Indo-Pacific. Ayres received an AB from Harvard College and an MA and PhD from the University of Chicago. She is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, the Trilateral Commission, the Halifax International Security Forum's Agenda Group, and served on the board of directors of the National Endowment for Democracy and the Women's Foreign Policy Group. In 2021 and 2022, the Washingtonian included her as one of their most influential people shaping policy. Dean Ayres will introduce tonight's speaker and moderate the audience Q&A. Dean Ayres, it is my pleasure to welcome you to the podium. And we also want to apologize, it's really hot in the room. We had a problem with our AC today. It's very hot outside, so really I apologize for that. We have a lot of cold drinks outside. Dean Ayres, and put in this yours.
Thank you, Professor Jedwab. I just want to echo our apology and explanation. The university has switched over from AC to heat mode. It happened over the weekend, and here we are, and it's kind of warm and toasty. That's why we have the shades down in the back. But let me just echo, welcome to the Elliott School, welcome to GW. It is my great pleasure to welcome all of you to tonight's Wenger Lecture. And we have the great honor this evening of hosting Ambassador Richard R. Verma for our fall Wenger Lecture this evening. He serves as the Deputy Secretary of State for Management and Resources. In this role, he serves as the Chief Operating Officer of the U.S. Department of State and leads the department's efforts on modernization, foreign assistance, and a wide range of workforce and strategic issues that you will hear about tonight. Deputy Secretary Verma previously served as the U.S. Ambassador to India, where he led one of the largest U.S. diplomatic missions anywhere in the world, and he championed historic progress in bilateral ties. He is also a former Assistant Secretary of State for Legislative Affairs and the former National Security Advisor to the Senate Majority Leader. Deputy Secretary Verma has also had a distinguished career in the private sector, most recently serving as the Chief Legal Officer and Head of Global Public Policy for MasterCard. He is a former partner at the law firm of Steptoe & Johnson, the former vice chairman of the Asia Group, a global consulting firm, and he has prior board service on the T. Rowe Price Corporate Board of Directors. He's also a veteran of the U.S. Air Force and the recipient of numerous military and civilian decorations, including the Meritorious Service Medal and the State Department's Distinguished Service Award. He's served on numerous boards, including the President's Intelligence Advisory Board, the Weapons of Mass Destruction and Terrorism Commission, and the Secretary of State's Foreign Affairs Policy Board. He's also served on nonprofit boards, including the Ford Foundation, Lehigh University, and the National Endowment for Democracy. He was a senior fellow at Harvard University's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs, and he holds multiple academic degrees, including a doctorate from a university that starts with George, not this one, Georgetown University, and he holds a law degree from American University. I think you'll hear tonight that his deep understanding of global affairs dynamics and international business makes him a really exceptional choice for the Wenger Lecture discussion. And so we're privileged to have him here with us today to share his insights and expertise. I would like to just note that this is the 6th edition of the Wenger Lecture, which is a biannual lecture series endowed by the Henry E. and Consuelo S. Wenger Foundation. This lecture is co-sponsored, as you can see, by the Institute for International Economic Policy, and it takes place alongside the biannual meetings of the IIEP Executive Circle. We are delighted to have members of the IIEP Executive Circle in attendance for this evening's lecture, and we are very grateful to Elliott alumna Wellesley Parker, who is a member of the Wenger family and a member of the Elliott School Board of Advisors, for her family's ongoing support of the Elliott School and IIEP. With that, please join me in giving a warm welcome to Ambassador Verma. Ambassador Verma, the podium is yours.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. When I said I was going to be giving a talk on climate change, I didn't know we'd experience right here in the room, but it's a lived experience. And I am really grateful to George Washington University, to the Elliott School, to your fantastic dean in particular for inviting me here today, and a special word of appreciation to the Wenger Foundation for their support of this lecture series. I know one of the objectives of this series is to provide GW students with a unique perspective on what a career in international affairs can look like, so hopefully we can touch on that today as well. I look forward to your questions on that and other topics that may be on your mind. But I will say, of course, I already feel like in many ways we know each other as classmates, with State Department buildings essentially part and parcel of the GW campus. We go to the same coffee shops. We shop at Whole Foods together. We have lunch at Tonic. We arrive at Foggy Bottom Metro with all of you. I'm really sorry about the long lines that we may create for all of you, but I'm also really fortunate to have had such incredible collaboration between GW and the State Department over so many years, and the hundreds, if not thousands, of graduates of GW that have come and served not only at state but across the federal government. We have 2 GW alums serving on my staff in the department. And again, to our dean, my special thanks for our 20-year partnership, both in and out of government, on India, for your incredible insights in your writings. I read your last book, Our Time Has Come, from cover to cover, and your scholarship on South Asia has given us such important insights on such an incredibly important part of the world, and I am looking forward to your next book soon, whenever that appears. So I've been in this role as Deputy Secretary for Management and Resources since April of 2023. Since that time, my staff tells me I've been to 45 countries and 65 of our embassies and consulates. From Ukraine to the Middle East to the Asia Pacific, Africa, and multiple stops in Latin America, I've been so privileged to meet our incredible workforce in every corner of the globe, often doing unseen and unsung work on behalf of the American people. In fact, I returned from every trip, yes, severely jet-lagged, but also incredibly inspired by our workforce, the 80,000 foreign service, civil service, and locally employed staff at nearly 300 locations working to bring peace and stability to difficult regions during a challenging time. I think about when I last spoke here at GW. It was an event with then Vice President Biden more than a decade ago. I think about all that has changed in the world around us since that time and what remains the same. Yes, we still have threats from malign states and actors looking to overturn the post-World War II architecture. Look no further than Putin's unlawful invasion of Ukraine and his attempt to redraw boundaries through brute force with devastating effects for Ukraine's infrastructure. We face the threat of terrorism, as we witnessed a year ago with the terrorist attack on Israel, and we've seen the resulting humanitarian crisis in the region thereafter. We continue to face significant great power global competition with China and challenges from malign state actors in North Korea and Iran. But there is a second category of threats and challenges from cross-border concerns or transnational challenges that actually know no boundary. And while we faced transnational threats in the past, I think the acceleration of these challenges has grown exponentially, especially since that time of our event with then Vice President Biden some 12 years ago. Let me mention three of these concerns that our Director of Central Intelligence has called, quote, problems without passports, end of quote. Of course, you've all lived through one of them, the impact of a worldwide pandemic. That is no longer a hypothetical concern, unfortunately. In a 30-day period in early 2020, the virus spread to 135 countries, and then over 3 years would kill some 20 million people. The modern era had not witnessed this level of devastation, and no army could repel or defeat it. It took international cooperation, and I think we can honestly assess that we were not ready. We have to do better to prevent and minimize the impact of the next pandemic. And today we are actively working towards that goal across the federal government and with our international partners. The other transnational challenge we've faced is from massive advances in technology. And yes, there have been many advances for good that have helped lift millions of people out of poverty, have connected billions to the internet, and have educated so many. But we've also seen the use of technology to surveil, to harass, to steal one's life savings, and to deliberately misinform. And now we see powerful new tools brought on by artificial intelligence that have, yes, vast power to educate and draw important conclusions, but also, if used improperly, could do great damage to societal fabrics across the globe. Again, the solution, it is really about setting the global rules of the road and building the international architecture to channel these technologies for economic empowerment and human development pursuant to rules and norms. This, too, is a massive work in progress with all the elements of our government and society, and the work continues at an urgent pace. The third transnational threat that we've witnessed is the one I want to talk to you about today in a bit more detail, and that's the impact we've seen from climate change, not just on economies or on our day-to-day lives, but on our national security and the global security ramifications that we all face. First, maybe just some basic facts about the challenge. According to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, 2023 was the hottest year ever recorded. Yet we are on pace to break that record in 2024. And this continues a dangerous trend, with the world experiencing the hottest 10 years on record in the prior decade. Present-day levels of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere are higher than any time in the past 800,000 years. The rate of sea level rise in the 20th century was faster than any other century in the past 3,000 years. And global temperatures have increased faster in the past 50 years than at any time than in the past 2,000 years. This is more than a troubling trajectory. We can no longer talk about the future risks from climate change. Climate change is here, and we are living through the consequences today. Let's just look at 2 months in August and September of this year. Again, according to NOAA and our own experience, here are a few events you may not have been tracking. Central Africa experienced torrential rains in Chad, impacting more than 2 million people and resulting in hundreds of deaths. Flooding in Bangladesh was some of the most severe on record, impacting millions and killing dozens. Our embassy in Hanoi was hit by Typhoon Yagi on September 7th, which brought intense rainfall, flooding, and landslides to the region for 2 days and claimed hundreds of innocent lives. The Caribbean and South America had the warmest January to August ever. Our embassy in Quito had to relocate 19 diplomatic families in September due to dangerous fires and the associated smoke. And of course, just since August, the Gulf of Mexico and Gulf states, Florida, and the East Coast have experienced incredibly severe storms, 2 Category 5 hurricanes, billions of property damage, and many lives lost. Again, we know of the vast economic and human toll that the Earth's warming and more frequent and severe weather events are having on global populations, on farming and basic subsistence, and in so many facets of daily life. In fact, there was nearly $300 billion in 2023 in lost revenue and damage due to severe weather impacts. But it's the climate and security concerns that are growing more real and more present by the day. We see the climate crisis increasing the severity of humanitarian global crises, adding to geopolitical tensions and causing disruptions to our operational readiness as a government. So let me address each of those vectors of concern. The first vector is the impact of climate on the most vulnerable around the world, those who are already facing poverty or internal civil strife, or those like small island nations that are especially vulnerable to climate impacts due to their high exposure. The intelligence community, in its climate change and national security estimate, predicted that the physical effects of climate change in these countries increase the potential for instability, humanitarian crises, and possible internal conflict. Our Director of National Intelligence, Avril Haines, notes that warmer temperatures could push tens of millions in sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and Latin America to be displaced and migrate to other regions. She noted how increasingly disruptive weather events can trigger crop failures, wildfires, energy blackouts, or infectious disease outbreaks, and signaled how droughts can lead to scarce resources that trigger conflicts and exacerbate violent extremism. She is exactly right, and we are already seeing these impacts today. Many countries are already on the brink of conflict or incredible governmental instability, and it's the impacts from climate change, impacts that serve to exacerbate existing tensions and fault lines, increasing the toll on the most vulnerable and giving a lifeline to extremist forces. Take, for example, the situations in Afghanistan and in Burma. The Afghan people are suffering from the brutality and oppression of the Taliban. It's the only country in the world where girls are denied the ability to attend school above the 6th grade. On top of decrees like these, the Afghan people have experienced widespread drought, food insecurity, skyrocketing food prices, flash floods, air pollution, exacerbating the harshness of life, and increasing the likelihood that Afghanistan remains a failed state. Again, the climate impacts have been particularly devastating to women and girls. As noted in our recently released 2024 U.S. Strategy to Empower Adolescent Girls Globally, girls and young women in Afghanistan and around the world face increased risk of gender-based violence, declines in well-being, including their mental health, and lack of access to essential services due to climate-related disasters. Similarly, in Burma, a nation experiencing deep internal conflict following the 2021 military takeover, faces unprecedented climate impacts, specifically from intensifying cycles of drought and monsoons that exacerbate the dire humanitarian situation. Burma has one of the world's highest concentrations of people subject to climate's impact. with some 40% of the nation residing in low-level and coastal regions, according to the Norwegian Institute for International Affairs. The humanitarian suffering has been intense, in addition to the ongoing oppression imposed by the military regime, fueling displacement and migration, including to Bangladesh, which is already facing its own developmental and climate-impacted challenges. Growing geopolitical risks is another vector I want to touch on briefly. Again, the National Intelligence Council predicts that climate change could exacerbate cross-border geopolitical flashpoints as countries seek to advance and protect their own interests. We see this already in the Arctic, where rapid warming is literally changing the political, economic, cultural, and security contours of the Arctic. The battle over water resources can also contribute to cross-border and regional tensions. Nearly 40% of the world's population depends on water that is shared with another country. We see potential for rising tensions, particularly in river basins where the rate of change is greater than can be absorbed by local institutions and agreements. Several transboundary rivers have been marked by historical grievances that exacerbate disputes over water management decisions, for example, in Central and South Asia or in the Mekong River Basin. Forced displacement and irregular migration is another mounting challenge. Estimates suggest that some 120 million people have been forcibly displaced, the highest number ever recorded. Now, conflict, violence, poverty, persecution, human rights violations and abuses, and yes, climate change-related disruptions push people to undertake often dangerous journeys in search of safety and better opportunities. It's hard to determine the exact number driven from their homes due to the impacts of the climate crisis, but clearly it is an increasing factor as climate shocks undermine livelihoods and exacerbate existing drivers of displacement. And the final threat vector I wanted to highlight is simply the impact on our operational readiness itself, on our troops and military families and facilities, on our foreign service and embassies and consulates abroad, and the global critical infrastructure that we rely on to preserve and protect U.S. interests. Secretary Austin recently wrote, quote, "Climate change fundamentally alters the conditions that shape military operations at home and around the world, and the Defense Department must both understand and adapt to the ways in which extreme weather and climate change our effect and our readiness and capabilities." Our federal government has not been immune to the damage by these extreme weather events. Again, the Defense Department has suffered tens of billions of dollars in damages from weather-related events, impacting training and equipment and base operations at key facilities, particularly along the coast. The State Department is also extremely forward deployed in climate-vulnerable areas, either along coastlines or in areas experiencing significant heat-related damage. And I already mentioned a couple of the examples we faced this year alone. And we've had to adapt, like our Defense Department colleagues, hardening our infrastructure, building climate-related factors into risk statements and operational plans, considering climate risks in our building and maintenance planning, and ensuring we have backup locations and personnel in the event a primary node is unable to operate because of a climate or weather-related disruption. And we are aggressively moving in that direction at state with our 2024 Climate Adaptation and Resilience Plan. As Secretary Blinken said in his opening to the plan, quote, "It is the most comprehensive climate risk strategy the department has ever done." I've given you only a glimpse into the climate and national security nexus. It is real, it is present, it is a threat to global safety, security, and order. Sherry Goodman, in her terrific new book on this subject, refers to climate change as a threat multiplier. Perhaps not the single cause of any one conflict or unrest, but certainly now a major contributing factor leading to exacerbating widespread insecurities. So I know that's a somewhat distressing future that I just laid out for you. But let me try to also put this in perspective and lay out some of the measures that we are taking to be better prepared and to help reduce the threat posed. So what are we doing about it? So combating climate change and its resulting impacts has been a huge priority for this administration, and I've been honored to help oversee international climate policy at the department following Secretary Kerry's departure as Special Presidential Envoy for Climate. So let me highlight 4 lines of work that I think are important to note. I will do it briefly, and then I look forward to your questions. First, we continue to work aggressively internationally to accelerate the clean energy transition and reduce global greenhouse gas emissions in this critical decade. It's a whole of government approach and, of course, the most direct and lasting way to keep the Earth from warming. Our diplomatic efforts take place at all levels and at multilateral institutions, and there could be no more important upcoming gathering than the UN Climate Change Conference next month in Baku, Azerbaijan. This is where countries across the world will come forward to make new commitments to global greenhouse gas reductions and announce further investments in mitigation and adaptation. We've also been advocating for climate ambition in the G20, where Brazil has made climate a key pillar in various tracks in the upcoming gathering of leaders. And we are also working very aggressively with countries to renew their Paris climate change commitments, which they do every 5 years in order to reach a net zero target. We've also been working aggressively with state and local officials who have stepped up and taken a lead role in combating climate change. I think you might all be surprised to know that hundreds of mayors across the United States have committed to support and raise collective ambition on the Paris targets, which is a great thing. Second, we've taken important steps in the executive branch itself with dozens of executive actions, such as the launching of the President's Emergency Plan for Adaptation and Resilience, or PREPARE, and the recently released U.S. Framework for Climate Resilience and Security. This framework document takes a holistic approach to focus on mapping and assessing climate security threats, ensuring we have a whole of government approach, including with our international partners, and then doubling down to build resilience in the most vulnerable areas. Similarly, PREPARE supports developing countries and communities in vulnerable situations to adapt and manage the impacts of climate change. Again, PREPARE, like the framework, takes a whole of government approach to coordinate over 20 federal departments in our efforts to address food and water insecurity, as well as political instability at all levels. Also, about 3 years ago, we released the White House report on the impact of climate change on migration. The first kind of its report from a national government. It outlines the need to scale up support to migrants, refugees, stateless persons, and it assesses all that we need to do to make humanitarian assistance more impactful and to deal with some of the real problems that cause people to flee their homes and their countries. Third, we've made massive federal investments into addressing the most direct threats, and we've worked hard to mobilize the private sector too. Let me give you a few data points. We delivered over $9.5 billion in fiscal year 2023 in international public climate finance. And we are on track to meet the President's pledge to work with Congress to scale up climate finance to over $11 billion annually by the end of this year. The Development Finance Corporation has put forward an ambitious commitment to climate, including $3.7 billion committed in FY23. The projects range from helping African farmers adapt to extreme weather and supporting climate resilient growth in rural Africa and the Indo-Pacific. Just recently, DFC committed $425 million to finance the construction and operation of a solar manufacturing facility in India. And just last week, the DFC announced the financial closure of a $1 billion deal, the world's largest debt conversion for conservation of a river and its watershed in El Salvador. And this is on top of the historic legislative initiatives mobilizing more than $1 trillion in investments in climate actions, such as from the Inflation Reduction Act, the CHIPS Act, and the Infrastructure Spending Bill. Fourth and finally, I wanted to make sure you knew we were doing our part at the State Department as well by building our climate diplomacy skills, upping our climate resiliency, and by setting our own net zero goal. We've made climate change and climate diplomacy specifically one of our 6 critical mission areas. We have 6 new courses at the Foreign Service Institute focused on climate. And we have 20 new climate officer positions created at key posts globally, where that officer's job 100% of the time is to work on climate-related issues and diplomacy. Looking at our own operations, we want to lead by example, not just because we want to be able to show that climate action is possible, but also because we were already seeing the impacts of climate on our own ability to complete our mission. And that's why the Climate Adaptation and Resilience Plan I referenced a few minutes ago details the breadth and depth of the impacts we need to be prepared for. Even under the most conservative emissions scenario, the department can expect nearly 2/3 of our overseas facilities and 90% of our personnel to be exposed to extreme heat events. So with this plan, we aim to mitigate current climate impacts and adapt to our climate future and ensure we can protect our people and operations abroad. All our efforts need to be based on the best available data so that we can make decisions based on what will have the most impact. And to that end, we've built a greenhouse gas inventory for the department's worldwide operations. And we don't have the complete data set yet, but we have enough to know that our power consumption is our largest source of emissions. And to address that, we've dedicated over $60 million over the next 2 years towards greater energy efficiency and renewable energy installations from Cape Town to Kingston. We are more than doubling the amount of energy we produce through solar power at our overseas posts. We are therefore trying to create efficiencies and convert to clean sources of power whenever possible. It's harder than it sounds when your organization literally spans the world, but 16 of our diplomatic posts are already running on 100% carbon-free electricity, and we have at least 10 more in the pipeline for this conversion. So, thank you for letting me cover this topic in some detail. It's greatly appreciated. But as you also know, this is going to be a generational challenge that will be with us for decades. There is certainly urgency to deal with the issues today, but clearly it will take time, it will take resources, advances in technology, and continued U.S. leadership. But we also need all of you. Now, I can't close without putting in a plug for considering working in foreign policy, development, or even the State Department one day. We have foreign service and civil service professionals from all 50 states. We hire from a variety of academic and professional backgrounds. Ensure we have our fair share of lawyers and folks with international relations degrees, which may be the most important, right? But we need engineers, we need accountants, we need business majors, English majors, science majors, we need doctors and nurses. You may also think you need to speak a foreign language to join the Foreign Service. You don't. We will teach you. We have a whole Foreign Service Institute devoted to teaching languages, tradecraft, leadership, and giving our new and more seasoned diplomats the tools they need to succeed when serving overseas. You know, the United States faces a pivotal juncture globally, a moment the president often refers to as an inflection point. The international landscape is complex and often dangerous. The choices we make today about our most fundamental values, safeguarding democracy, stability, and prosperity for all, will shape the trajectory of our country and global community for generations to come. We can't turn away from it, and U.S. leadership is essential. We simply need all of you to be involved. It could be here on your campus. It can be in your local communities. And if you choose to, maybe an embassy or consulate one day too. I know the United States and the world will be beneficiaries of our investments today, and they'll be beneficiaries for all that you will contribute to the world as well. thank you for your time, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Secretary Verma, for that. I'm going to follow up and ask a couple questions. The mics are on, and then we'll open this up for questions from the audience. So the first thing I wanted to ask you is you could speak just in a little bit more detail about this connection between climate and national security. How does the State Department think about that climate agenda in different diplomatic areas? What I had in mind was bilateral conversations. You'll have a laundry list of issues to pursue. How do you make sure climate stays on that agenda? How do you make sure it doesn't fall off when something else urgent arises?
Yeah. Well, I don't think we have a choice, right? It is, as I mentioned, it's now one of our 6 critical mission areas. This is something Secretary Blinken laid out 3 years ago this month at a set of remarks at the Foreign Service Institute, where he identified climate as one of those key areas that we have to focus on, and not just identifying it as a problem, but building the capacity of the department to deal with the issue. And so this is why there's 20 climate officer positions, the 6 new courses. We've really put a lot of effort into this. I don't know that we even have the option of not having it as one of the principal issues that confront us, because as I mentioned, it almost doesn't matter where you go in the world. This is a topic of concern. And yes, of course, I mentioned the risk to developing states. But again, I also mentioned what we're facing here in our country, what happens in other states in the world that are much more developed. And so we don't have the ability to put it somewhere else. It impacts us economically, strategically, in humanitarian basis. And again, the security elements is what I was focused on today. So it continues to remain top of the list. The question is, what are we all trying to do about it, right? And so I think your question, we work on it multilaterally. I mentioned the G20, the climate conference coming up in Azerbaijan, the renewal of the Paris commitments. This is something I worked on in India in 2015. These are hugely consequential efforts. The financing is a big issue. You know, the global south, and I don't love that term because it refers to a bunch of different countries around the world, but the global south says to us, look, you were able to kind of develop to your maximum extent possible in the 20th century and prior to that. And now when you hit your peak development, you're coming and telling all of us we have to scale back our development. And yes, you're promising this great economic transition that will come one day, and we believe that. But what would you like us to do in the intervening decades before those green jobs are here and before we can fully adapt? So those are real conversations we have to have. And again, the other good news is not just the world is taking it seriously. We'll say the technology is moving incredibly fast. And that is a very exciting part of it. It is hard for me to keep up with. I mean, I love spending time with folks who work in this sector, because the issues, again, that we were dealing with even 10 years ago about storage and distribution and grid reliability, a lot of technology that is now moving on to have solved those issues, not completely, but moving on to the next set of challenges.
Well, maybe I could pick up on that. Can you say a little bit about how state engages the private sector? Because this innovation piece, these are technical and technological kinds of questions. So how does state connect with where this innovation is happening?
Yeah, I think we have to remember what the role of government is, what the role of the State Department is. We don't have a gigantic research lab somewhere, right? We are not making the next kind of EV or incredibly secure and reliable chips, but other people are out there. Other companies are. So we got to look at what we do and where's our value add. And then, yes, we need the private sector. We need academia. We need civil society. These are global challenges that governments alone cannot solve. And so I've been very pleased and proud of the role that the private sector has played. I've seen this, I mentioned, and what the DFC is doing. I look at how we've changed even our financial aid, or financial foreign assistance model. I mentioned financial aid here at GW. But our foreign assistance model, DFC is meant, the Development Finance Corporation is meant to actually stimulate much larger investments by putting in risk insurance products or coming in with a first round of equity investments. But the reality is the private sector has to come in and do the research, development, deployment, again, along with industry partners, with civil society partners. So I think if we know our role is about the rules of the road, doing the diplomacy, mobilizing, again, to the extent we can, the global community in the key sectors that we talked about here, then I think we have this nice balance, but we have very, very good partnerships at the department with the private sector, which are critical.
I'd like to ask you a question about India, given all your experience there.
Yeah.
You were U.S. ambassador to India when India decided it would join the Paris Climate Agreement in 2015. And India since then has made great progress on renewables, but it's also increasing its fossil fuel consumption as its economy grows. How does the State Department engage on climate with India? It's now the third largest energy consumer. It's hugely important to the way the world thinks about energy, thinks about emissions, thinks about the global future.
Yeah. And I feel kind of silly talking to you about the India relationship. You literally wrote the book on U.S.-India relations and what's going on in India. But what I say to people, and when I look at the next decade of cooperation with India, I think energy is the single largest pathway of our cooperation. That surprises people when I say that. They think, oh, what about defense, or what about trade or agriculture? And I just say, we are two of the three largest emitters in the world. Our populations are being impacted, clearly. It's having strategic impacts, commercial impacts. But we also have this great private sector, this spirit of innovation that is, again, moving very aggressively to deploy new technologies. How we support each other in that, how we share information, how we partner. We are, again, I mentioned the DFC contribution to build some more solar panel manufacturing in India. There's also a commitment with the Indians to build 10,000 electric buses.
Oh, wow.
That is real. That is measurable. People can see it. So it's not just some rhetorical kind of foreign policy thing. It is areas of cooperation that will change people's lives, not just in our two countries, but globally. And we'll say, I remember going out to confirm to the ambassador in India in December of 2014. And at that time, remember John Podesta and the president, they made it really clear, one of your top issues is the Paris Climate Agreement, and how can we bring India along? And I think about how the relationship between President Obama and Prime Minister Modi changed for the good in the numerous discussions they had about climate. And this concept of having individually declared contributions in the Paris framework, I will say, came out of a lot of discussions that the president had with the prime minister, in that, we were going to set targets globally, but we were going to let countries figure out how to get there. And that was a bit of a breakthrough. And I tell people all the time that breakthrough between the U.S. and India and then the global community in India, it brought so many other countries along, but it also showed what can happen when the world's two largest democracies actually get together and come together. It can have a pretty big impact.
I'm going to reserve one last question, or I'm going to ask you to offer some advice to our students. So let's reserve that to the end. Let's open it up to questions from our large audience gathered here. I think we have mics in the aisles, so we can make sure to pick up the questions for those joining by Zoom or for those listening in another way. We'll go ahead and start over here.
Hello, my name is Himon Chan. I'm with the UCDC program for UC Los Angeles. And my question was on the Paris Agreement. As you know, under the Trump administration, we actually backed out of the Paris Agreement. And under the Biden administration, we entered back in. But what is your take on the extent of the damage that has caused the climate movement? And what is the State Department doing to reassure other actors that something like this will happen again, especially with the possibility of a second Trump term that he might repeat the same thing?
One of the great aspects of this job is I don't get to do politics. I understand we have an election coming up in a couple of weeks. But let me just say, I believe that the urgency of this issue and the centrality of this issue hopefully has become less politicized. It'll be a test. We will see what happens in a couple of weeks. But I will say our role in this agreement is so critically important. It shows a leadership role. It brings the world community together. And it is life-changing and it is life-saving in so many areas. And it is critical for our own security. It's critical for our partners' security. It's critical for our economic vitality. So, again, I believe this 10 years ago. I believe even more strongly today that Paris and then the resulting other agreements that we have, both bilaterally and other multilateral agreements that we have with international partners, are essential to our own prosperity and security in the years ahead. And I hope and believe leaders understand that.
I saw a hand over here.
Hello, my name is Sia Goswami, and I'm a first-year student here at the Elliott School. So, as you mentioned in your talk, the U.S. is involved in developing and providing financial aid for renewable energy infrastructure in developing countries. But oftentimes, the governments of these countries, India included, cannot fund the upkeep of this infrastructure, nor really foster a sense of acceptance towards these new technologies and practices. So I wanted to ask you, what is the U.S. doing or should do to ensure that this infrastructure is actually making an impact?
Yeah, it's a great point because what you're describing is, years ago we would go to the grand opening of a solar field in a particular place, and not just India, but in other parts of the world. And then, unfortunately, if you went back 2 or 3 years later, that solar field may or may not be covered with dust and debris and did not have the maintenance, the training, the upkeep that is required. And I think that's been a learned experience, frankly, for us, for our counterparts, whether in India or in other places of the world, that you need a workforce that is trained, that you not only fund the initial building of the facility, but also the deployment of it, that you also have to, this is an education for Americans, for others that haven't necessarily had to rely on renewable sources of energy before, how to use it, how to preserve it, how to protect it. So I actually think we have learned a fair amount, but I think your point is really good, that it can't just be the ribbon cutting and the kind of grand opening. It's got to be how do we deploy it? How do we store it? How do we measure its impact? Is there uptake on this particular source of energy? Is it displacing more traditional carbon-based sources of energy? Those are all really important factors. I think this is in many ways, we're building the plane as we're flying it, and I think we're learning a lot as we're going.
Another question, we'll go over here.
Hi, Deputy Secretary. My name is Kate Young. I'm a senior at the GW School of Business. My question today revolves more around the innovation that you talked about and the technological future that we see.
Yeah.
Could you just expand a little bit more on where you think, or maybe like the gaps of technology that we're seeing right now as it alludes to national security, some trends that we might be seeing in the future, and what you hope to see maybe in the further distant future?
Unrelated to climate or potentially related?
As climate change and as it relates to national security.
Yeah. So look, I just go back to India for a second. We have like 38 bilateral dialogues between the U.S. and India. I gotta believe like 36 of 38 dialogues have technology as some pillar, some breakout session, because it's almost in everything that we do, because it has such widespread ramifications, from the sharing of data to the digital economy to, again, law enforcement concerns about technology. But then we have our own efforts to develop the rules of the road when it comes to artificial intelligence, when it comes, again, to how do we prosecute cyber crimes around the world. This is an area of law and diplomacy of which, unfortunately, we are at the beginning. We are moving too slow, and the technology is moving so rapidly, and we are all struggling to catch up. Again, just give you an example on personal data protection. You go from California to New York to Europe to India to take your pick anywhere else in the world. We all have different rules on what it means to protect one's digital identity or your personal data in the cyber domain. Now, we will eventually get to a place where I believe there will be a much more accepted global standard, but we're not there. So how do you navigate these next few years? The use of artificial intelligence, great example. And we've made, I think, really good progress in this area. Had a very widely adopted UN convention on the importance of norms in artificial intelligence, or really important Council of Europe treaty on artificial intelligence. So we are building, but we are not building fast enough. The architecture to protect people's privacy, to protect their interests, to protect their security. And meanwhile, adversaries, malign actors, criminal enterprises are using that technology for very harmful purposes. And so we have to build defenses against that as well. So when we look, again, back to what we're doing at the department, we have a now 2-year-old Bureau of Cyber Diplomacy and Security, first ever. People said, why do you need a whole separate bureau of the department to focus on cybersecurity? Well, you look at the threats, but also look at the opportunities. This is an area that's incredibly exciting and incredibly daunting at the same time. And it has obviously a huge impact in the climate space too.
Let's take another question. I saw your hand over here.
Thank you so much for the talk. My name is Esther Key, and I'm a student here at GW. And a moment ago, you were talking about the global south and its sort of frustration when it comes to climate action with developed countries. So my question is, for developing countries facing budget constraints, should their policy priority be more focused on mitigating or adapting to the effects of climate change? And when it comes to international climate finance, is the U.S. currently more invested in either one?
It's a great point, and a very good question. Let me just say, I've mentioned some of the data that that we've done, it was, around $10 billion, our commitment on international climate finance last year. We will reach 11 billion this year. Those are big numbers in a budget. Our State Department budget is $60 billion, give or take a few each year. And that's for operations and for programs. So when we're coming up with $11 billion just to respond to climate needs, it's a lot. Again, I look at what our role can be and how this finance challenge is going to be met. And it's going to be met, yes, by governments, yes, by our aid partners, USAID and DFC. It's going to be met by international financial institutions. The World Bank, IMF, IFC have huge roles to play, our multilateral partners. But again, private sector and private equity, take your pick, they're going to play a large role in this too. Not because this is such a huge, money-making opportunity, but this is an area of concern to billions of people around the world. We need the private sector to be engaged. And so I think it is this combination that will frankly come in and help alleviate some of those concerns. I don't think, if you're sitting in a developing country, I don't think you choose between mitigation or adaptation. You really are going to need the assistance. And I think, again, we can do a better job of channeling that assistance to the countries and places that need it the most.
So we're nearly out of time. I am going to take the moderator's privilege of asking the last question. Deputy Secretary Verma, you've gotten to hear from some of our students today. Let me ask you to provide our students a little bit of advice. You've had an incredible international affairs career in the public and the private sectors. You've been on boards of nonprofit organizations. What advice would you offer our students as they think about their own directions ahead in international affairs?
Yeah. So I kind of ended up in international affairs as a bit of a accident, but it was the right thing that happened. I actually grew up wanting to be an astronaut, and
I never knew that.
Here I am. Yeah. And I, went to Lehigh University. I was studying engineering at Air Force ROTC scholarship, served in the Air Force, and then I met advanced calculus and thermodynamics and a few other subjects, and then I started working here in Washington as an intern, and kind of life readjusted itself back to both what I was interested in and what I had a little bit more talent. And I guess I would say to everyone, and I've tried to stay within that national security and foreign policy, service, law kind of bucket for a while. And I would just say, look, one, life doesn't move in a straight line, and you've got to be able to kind of navigate your way through some challenging times as well. But also stay true to what you feel. Like, what you want to do when you grow up. You're all grown up. I'm still figuring it out every couple of years. But you have a sense, and I think even more so today, because of social media, because of social networks, we feel like we've got to do things that other people or organizations might expect us to do. And that starts to take you down a bit of a track that you may or may not want to be on. And so, don't forget, you've got this passion about something, you've got a skill set in something, hopefully they overlap. And then it may not be the perfect job when you graduate from here, right? And I don't know that the perfect job necessarily exists, but you start to piece it together over time, and you draw upon that passion and that skill set. And I think the final thing I would say is just, no matter what career you choose, I put in a plug for us, but I think what they're training you here to do is to have an impact. And again, that can be in private sector, it can be in the public sector, it can be in nonprofit, it can be in academia. But it's about, as you look around the world, you turn on the TV, you see the news, there's a lot of challenges in the world. There's also a lot of good in the world. There's a lot of promise in the world. And I think it's up to all of you to figure out how you want to contribute to that in some way. It could be in your community, in your neighborhood, in your school. It could be much bigger than that, but stay true to that passion and find that way to have that impact that makes you feel good each day.
We are so lucky to have you here for our Wenger Lecture. Please join me in thanking Deputy Secretary Verma.